Hello, welcome to Books. I'm Jessie Gray. We have what I think will be a very, very unusual and interesting program tonight. The Honorable Hamilton Fish. He was a congressman for 25 years. He served 12 years before Franklin Roosevelt came into office, and all through Franklin Roosevelt's terms of office, all through World War II. He's now written 3 books at once out for the bicentennial. The one we'll be discussing at length is FDR, The Other Side of the Coin, subtitled How We Were Tricked into World War II. He's written an historical account of New York State, the battleground of the Revolutionary War, New York's part in the Revolutionary War. And the third, The American People Are Living on Top of a Nuclear Volcano. We'll get to that book too. Welcome now, Senator Fish. I'm sorry, not Senator, Congressman Fish.
Well, I'm very happy to be here and happy to answer any questions you ask.
Well, I'll ask one. You say that we did not, in your book, FDR, The Other Side of the Coin, we did not need to get into World War II, and in fact, Franklin Roosevelt tricked us into World War II.
Oh, yes, that's exactly it. As I said in the book, it's very easy to prove, we were tricked into World War II. I have probably more right to speak on that than anybody who's alive, because at that time I was the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives. I was ranking member of the Rules Committee, and it was my duty, after the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor the next day, to take the radio, and in fact it's the first radio ever used in the Congress of the United States, and to uphold President Roosevelt in his Day of Infamy speech, to curse out the Japs, that they had gone into this war during peace negotiations, and call them every bad name I could imagine, talking to about 25 million people and to the Congress. And now I have to repudiate every word I said at that time.
At that time you believed it?
I believe thoroughly the Japanese had attacked us, and I thought they had attacked us during negotiations for peace, and everybody in the whole country believed that. And naturally I was the main spokesman for those who did not want to go to war on this attack, and I made that first speech at that time. Now, of course, I disavow it all because of the evidence I have found later on.
What evidence?
The evidence is simply this, that no member of the Congress knew it at the time of Pearl Harbor, and no Democrat or Republican knew it, but 10 days before Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt called his war cabinet together in the White House. That's not his real cabinet. It consisted of 6 men, himself, Secretary Hull, Secretary of State, Secretary Stimson of War, Secretary Knox of the Navy, General Marshall, and Admiral Stark. And all they discussed there was how to force and goad and compel Japan to get into the war.
Why did they want us in the war?
Well, as Claire Luce said, I don't use that strong language in my book. I said he tricked us into war. Claire Luce said he lied us into war to get into war with Germany. And he was very anxious to get into the war, so he knew the only way to do it was to get into war with Japan first. And so the next day, he served this ultimatum, a war ultimatum, on Japan to get out of Indochina, China, and Manchuria with all their armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, police, and everything else. And the Japanese, like cornered rats, had nothing else to do but fight, or to commit suicide or kill their emperor and their generals and their admirals. The American people don't know that even to this day, not more than 2%. If you asked you probably or anybody else, they would say we got into war on account of Pearl Harbor. It was because they were goaded into war. And we, American people, were tricked into war. And as Claire Lewis properly said, which I don't use quite such strong language, we were lied into war.
But the Japanese had expanded into China. They were expanding.
They were in China.
Germany had taken over Europe. It was on the threshold of trying to take over Britain. Didn't we, in fact, have to go to war? Didn't the American people have to be tricked by some ghastly disaster into changing their thinking and not being isolationist?
Well, in the first place, there never was an isolationist. They were non-interventionists from war. 85% of the people. And they did their own thinking, and they didn't want to get into another foreign war. They'd been in one, and they turned the tide of defeat into victory, and they got very little thanks, and practically none, and they wanted to keep out of the war. And all polls, 85% of the people, just before Pearl Harbor, I took a vote in my district 2 months before Pearl Harbor and just said, "You favor going to war, keep out?" It was 10-1 everywhere. In Hyde Park, where the president lived, in Poughkeepsie, and all the big towns, the 5 cities in my district, all the country districts, all 10-1. It would have been the same in all over America except in New York. You might have found it been 3 or 4-1 for keeping out of war. You can't tell me that those people, they were thinking people of all different classes, and they'd made up their minds, and they didn't want to get into that war unless they were attacked. They were willing to give money to Great Britain and arms to defend Great Britain, which they did, and Great Britain was able to defend themselves, and there was no chance of their being taken over by an armed force from Hitler or anybody else, because Hitler tried it and couldn't do it.
Well, Great Britain aside, France had already been taken over.
France had been taken over.
The Balkan states had been taken over. Everything had been taken over
in Europe had been taken over. Holland, Belgium. Hitler, as much as I'm opposed to him because I think he's a bloody murderer, but he made 5 overtures of peace to England. But he would get out of France, Belgium, Holland, all over, go back to the Rhine if they would give him the green light to attack Russia. That's the one thing he wanted to do. He wanted to go towards the east, never wanted to go to the west, because he wanted to get the oil there and the wheat lands. And if anybody reads the Mein Kampf, you'll find that's the whole reason of the writing of Mein Kampf. So they had plenty of opportunities to settle on that basis. And
settle what, though? That he would not?
On the basis that give Germany, Hitler, a green light, these 2 bloody murderers, to fight each other, Stalin and Hitler.
And you're saying
Harry Truman was in favor of that, President of the later President of the United States. Bob Taft was in favor of that. Half a dozen of the Democratic senators or leaders and Republican leaders, I know I was strongly in favor of it too. I was spokesman of my party in the House. Let those 2 gangsters, murderers, fight each other to the death, and let the rest of the world sit on the sidelines just cheering them on and say, and hoping they destroy and kill each other.
But you're saying that if we had given Hitler the green light, you're saying he would not have gone into Europe, he would have instead only gone toward Russia?
He was already in Europe. He would have gotten out of Europe if we'd given him the green light.
You think he would have withdrawn his troops from Western Europe?
That was the whole thing. That's what he asked for. No question about that. And then he would gone into Russia. And that would have taken years of fighting and taking over Russia if he won. And he might have saved the whole world. I suppose Hitler, of course, he should have been killed by some assassin. He probably would have been. But if he destroyed communism, he'd save the whole world, because communism is our greatest enemy, and the greatest enemy of freedom in the entire world, and the greatest threat to the destruction through nuclear weapons of 100 million or more Americans.
I see your point that if you pitted Hitler, one dictator, against Stalin, another dictator, perhaps they would have at least worn each other out to a certain extent, although of course one would have won and eventually become the dictator over the other. But are you saying, in fact, that you think that Hitler was to be trusted, that if we had given him the green light, he would have withdrawn from Europe?
I don't trust
and
Hitler
only
on anything,
gone
but I
toward
can
Russia?
say to you, when Hitler asked that, he wasn't forced to do it. He was asking permission to attack Russia, green light, And that's all he asked.
But did he need our permission?
Because if he didn't, he would have been he was at war with the Allies.
But did he
He's
need our
already-
permission?
Of course he had to. He couldn't go in and attack if he was in war with the other nations. He was to get out of these France and all the other countries.
You actually
Holland,
think he would have gotten out of France, Holland, Norway,
There's
Belgium?
no question about it. He wouldn't even ask for it unless he was going to do it, because he had to do it before it went into effect. There's no question about that.
You honestly think so? Do you think he would have withdrawn all of his attack against Britain?
Britain wasn't Britain was in the war, and the leader in the war, but they were not able to go across the Channel. Nobody's crossed the Channel. The Armada never crossed it. Napoleon never crossed it. And Louis XVI never did, and neither did Hitler. It wasn't that. It was a question of simply going towards and destroying communism, which he hated. And I think he wanted to do it, and that was his main objective during his entire life. But when he couldn't do it, of course, he fought the French and all, and came into the West, and of course defeated the Western troops for a number of years.
Why do you think, why did Roosevelt wanted us to enter
Well,
the
there
war?
are 5 reasons that Roosevelt wanted the war. First, Roosevelt was truly an internationalist. He ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket in 1920, I think it was, with a man by the name of Cox from Ohio. And Roosevelt was the vice presidential candidate. That ticket upheld the League of Nations, and that was the main issue. That was international, this issue, and he was the most outspoken man of them all. So I don't hold that against him. He had a right to be if he wanted. He had a right to be for war if he wanted to be. 85% of the American people were against war. But he was for war for other reasons. The main reason he was for war was he instituted the New Deal. And the New Deal had actually fallen apart. And at the end of 7 years of the New Deal, there were many more million unemployed than were at the start of it. There were 12 million Americans unemployed, according to the American Federation of Labor. And so he didn't see any way of getting it. The New Deal had failed, so he thought, here's one way out. We can get people employed. We'll get into this war on the side of the Allies. And of course, he did. He got us in by trickery, without the knowledge of the American people at all. And by issuing this war ultimatum to Japan, which they don't even know about today. And I feel what he did was in defiance of 85% of the American people, in defiance of the Congress, and in repudiation of the Constitution of the United States. I don't want any president, whether he's a Republican or Democrat, to get this country into war without the consent of the people and the Congress and know what they're doing. But he he just tricked us into the war. That's
Where is this ultimatum now? Where is the proof? Where did you find the proof that you're using in your book?
Well, the ultimatum was sent the next day after they decided on goading and forcing Japan into war. The secret cabinet meeting, which of course is the biggest cover-up in all of history. As a result of that cover-up and of the ultimatum, which was sent the next day to get out of China, Indochina, and Manchuria with all the Japanese forces, that was strictly covered up. No member of Congress knew that till long after Pearl Harbor. And as a result of that war, we lost 300,000 Americans, 700,000 killed, and it cost us $400 or $500 billion.
But
now, and the proof of the ultimatum was that after the next day or 2 days later, the president saw Secretary Stimson, and he said, will it be necessary to send another ultimatum to Japan because they haven't responded already and gone into war?
Is this on?
And you asked a very intelligent question. And that's why I wrote the book and how I was able to write the book, because I couldn't have written the book without it.
It's on
Secretary of
record.
War Stimson wrote in his memoirs exactly what happened, as I explained. And it's in his memoirs in Yale University. Anybody can get it. And he explained that all they talked about is how to force, goad, and compel Japan to get into war and to get out. Then he said the next day, or 2 days later, Roosevelt came to him and said, we send another ultimatum. I didn't invent this word ultimatum of war. It was Roosevelt's name, and speaking to Stimson said, should we send another war ultimatum to him to get out because they haven't done anything yet. So there's no question about that. The worst part of the whole thing, though, is that it's been this enormous cover-up. The American people have, not 2% of them people know about it today. There's no question about the facts that I'm presenting to you. I don't think anyone will deny it today. I was fooled for years till I found out what Henry Stimson said and checked it up. I spent 7 or 8 years, 10 years writing this book. And I quote nothing but Democrats all the way through. And nobody even disputes a single statement I've made so far in that book, and they never will, because it's based on the truth, or I wouldn't have written it.
Well, you're saying that Roosevelt wanted the war for 2 reasons,
No,
as I
I'm
understand.
giving you some more reasons.
Internationalist, economic reasons.
Economic reasons, because of the New Deal failure and 10, 12 million employed. Also, the implied promises he made to Churchill and the French that he'd get into the war. He wanted them to get into the war with Hitler, and he was urging them on all the time. And so as a result of that, he had a definite moral obligation to get us in if he could. He would have taken us into war 2 years before if it wasn't for the Congress of the United States and the American people. Now, I'm going to say to you right now, as long as we're talking on this, the non-interventionists, which you call different names, the non-interventionist war, 85% of the people, and their representatives in Congress, did keep us out of war until the attack on Pearl Harbor. If we had gotten into war 6 months before, then Hitler would never have attacked Russia and Stalin, where he lost 3 million German members of his army, practically all his tanks, his airplanes, heavy artillery, and his oil. And if we'd gone into the war, we would have lost millions and millions of Americans and millions more wounded, and that's why they ought to vote the utmost gratitude to those non-interventionists that kept us out of war to Pearl Harbor, because if we'd gone in 6 months before, Hitler never would have attacked Russia. He'd had us on his hands, and we'd been the losers, and there'd probably been a deadlock with all that enormous force of Germans, and the non-interventionists should put up statues to all the leaders for keeping us out of war at that time.
Let me ask you this. There was Mussolini expanding, Japan expanding, Hitler expanding.
Sure.
Churchill side evidently historically
Wait a minute,
quoted as a side in relief when we got into the war.
They ain't all
What
expanded.
if we'd gone in even earlier and stopped them before they expanded, so that we didn't have to push them back? Don't you think perhaps we were too late in getting into
Let's concentrate on what you
it?
said. And Russia expanded.
Right.
Russia made war on Finland. And Russia afterwards, of course, took over 100 million people in Central Europe, 100 million people who were free people, and communized them. That's the most imperialist nation in all the world. Now, these other nations, England was, up to that time, was the great imperialist nation. They owned half the world. How are they going to say to some other nation, you mustn't take some little country or not? And France had an enormous lot of imperialist country down in Africa and all over the world. And Italy was the same. So this wasn't to take over Austria, it wasn't something that we should go to war about, because they were half German. And to take over Danzig was 90% German. And the American people didn't even know where Danzig was. Why should we lose 2 or 3 million people if we got in the war ahead of time for a place we never heard of, Danzig? Oh no, this is.
But if we hadn't gone in at all.
Well, just what I told you.
You honestly.
What President Truman and Bob Taft and all these leaders and myself all wanted Hitler to fight the communists and destroy the communists. And don't think of the past, think of what it is today. Communism is the greatest threat to America and the world. And they can destroy us probably now as we sit here and kill 100 million Americans, which I'll discuss later in the book I've written. But Russia, what I'm objecting to, that one man can defy the Constitution of the United States, because the Congress is the only one sole authority to declare war, that he tricked us into war without the knowledge of Congress, without the knowledge of the American people, and they had nothing to do with it. And it's actually an impeachable offense.
Do you think that the same thing in
I
different...
don't want any future president, whether he's Republican or Democrat, to take us into war without the knowledge of the American people, without the knowledge of the Congress.
Do you think
That's why I
that the
wrote
same
book.
thing in slightly very different sheep's clothing happened in Vietnam?
Oh no, Vietnam was entirely different. I opposed going into the war in Vietnam. I went down before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee 5 years before Vietnam and fought the Cito Treaty and told that Democratic committee then, for a whole hour I talked to them. And I said, what you should do, you should put an amendment to the Cito Treaty and in the Senate and in the Congress that we will not send any troops to Vietnam unless it's by an declaration of war by the Congress.
But again,
if we had done that and then issued a declaration of war, the war had been over in a year. Then we could have bombed them, we could have mined them, we'd been within international law. As it was, they didn't do it, and we lost all these men almost for nothing. And as a result of it, it might be interesting, the public, long as you raise these issues, were not in my book, but I will tell you that the senator from Rhode Island, Democrat too, is now on the Foreign Relations Committee. And he read my speech, the whole hour speech before the Foreign Relations 20 years ago, to keep out of Vietnam, and he put in the Congressional Record a whole 2 or 3 column, a tribute to Hamilton Fish. And here's a Democratic senator, and I'm a Republican congressman. He says he's the only one that foresaw what should have been done at that time. So I was against going into that war, as I was against going into World War II.
And do you think the same thing happened in both to this extent, that the president got us involved in the war without the consent of Congress?
Well, I think it was wrong. I think I was opposed to it. I think, yes, I think that both the Democratic presidents at that time, Kennedy and Johnson, got us into the war. And Nixon, whether you like him or not, was the one that settled the war and bombed them and released our prisoners and won a so-called peace and got them out of the war.
We're running out of time.
But that's my book. I want to get back to my book.
I want to get back to your books too. Tell us briefly. You say at first you were great friends of FDR, then you became deadly enemies, and you really go at him in your book. And no.
Well, mine's only truth. There's nothing personal at all. I think he really hated me. I was a very good friend of his for 20 years. He wanted me to succeed him as a state senator in New York. We're in the same district. I was a follower of Bull Moose, a follower of Theodore Roosevelt.
Can you describe his personality in about
Yes, he had a very charming personality. He was very good looking, had a great deal of appeal, and had a splendid voice, and on the radio made magnificent speeches, and he had a certain amount of
which you add that is in a golden tones that his ghostwriter had written for him?
Oh, that's just it. He was not a good speaker, except when they wrote his speeches. And he had the best ghostwriters. He had about half a dozen. They were the best in the country. He did speak very well, and he had a little sarcasm, and a little vindictiveness, and a little humor, and was the best speaker of the time.
Would you call him an egomaniac?
As an individual, I've spoken to him many times when he spoke himself up in the district, because I know him very well. He was not much of a speaker.
Was he an egomaniac?
What is what?
An egomaniac.
Well, he was that. I wasn't going to call him that, but he had a tremendous lust for power. Once he got in, he wouldn't give that presence up unless he was dead. And he was a dying man.
That's what he did.
He fooled the Democratic Party completely when he was nominated and elected the 4th term. He was a dying man then. And that's 2 months before Yalta. A few months before Yalta. And he just fooled them, and so I say the Democrats are not responsible for Roosevelt and what he did and how he sold us out and betrayed us at Yalta and turned over half the world to the communists.
To the Communist Party.
We won that war, and we lost it at Yalta.
Yes,
all
we did.
Because a sick and dying man was fooled by Stalin. He turned everything over to Stalin and communized the world.
Was he fooled by him? You say he was surrounded by communist sympathizers in his government.
No, I never sympathizers, not communists. Yes, there were a number of them sympathizers, but not communists. He was completely fooled, and he had communist friends. He admits so, and in my book will show he wrote a letter saying he had these communist friends. And he thought foolishly that Russia would be our best friend after the war. And just before he died,
he really thought that.
He woke up just before he died to what they were doing. They had betrayed the whole Yalta agreements Stalin had. So Roosevelt found out about it a week or two before he died and wrote Stalin a couple of very strong letters. But that's the tragedy of the whole thing. You have
But
to
he
be
didn't do anything
It was too
about
late.
it.
He couldn't do anything. He found out he was being betrayed, and it was too late. He wrote these letters, and he knew and he died knowing he was betrayed. But of course, the blame is on Roosevelt. He's the one responsible for it, and he couldn't do anything about it. And he's the one that turned us over to half the world of communism.
You know, we could go on, and I wish we could. You'll have to come back at length. We have 4 minutes left. You say that you sent President Ford a copy of The American People Are Living on Top of a Nuclear Volcano, and that
Yes, I sent him
on the
to-
strength of
last
this
week
book
it-
he could be elected.
Yeah, well, anybody could be elected who followed what I said. I made it very clear. It took 7 years to write this book, too, and make it very clear that the communists have a 2-to-1 superiority over us in heavy weapons. And they can destroy 100 million Americans in the twinkling of an eye. The other 100 might as well not be alive. I haven't got time to go into that. One of their SS-9s, a 25 megaton, can destroy New York for 40 miles around. They'd lose 10 million people in one night here in New York. Now, we have no 25 megatons. We have no 20s. We have no 15s. We have no 10s. We have some submarines which destroy 5 or 10% of their population. We have a lot of 1 megaton, but their big weapons can destroy most of those too. So they are in a position to destroy us, and the reason I think they're not doing it is they're on the verge of war with China now. And all I ask is that we build 100 SS-9 of 25 megatons, and then no nation will dare attack us. And that then they'll begin to disarm. But they know that they have a superiority, and as long as they have, they can destroy. They can press the button right as you and I are talking here.
Do you know the show is over?
Know who?
Our program is ended.
Oh,
Could
I'm
you?
sorry, I could talk for an
I
hour.
could too. Would you please come back again?
Yes, I'll
We'd
come
be-
back anyway. But I want to be shaven next time,
You
and
do.
I want to be have my hair brushed.
As a
But
closing
I'll come back.
prediction, would you like to predict
But
the
I'm
outcome of
telling
the
you,
election?
if I come down and talk with a pretty girl like you, I'll be like that
Well,
Governor Carter. I'll begin to get lust in my eyes. And I'm too old to do that.
we don't believe Congressman Fish at all because he is getting married probably on the day that you see this program. It's being taped beforehand.
I thought we lost it. I don't care. It's all right.